So good morning and welcome to the Built Heritage Subcommittee meeting of November 13th, 2020. I'd like to call the members to order. This meeting is being held remotely through Zoom, which is necessary in these times of physical distancing to keep everyone safe during the pandemic. Even though our meetings are being held remotely, I'd like to acknowledge that Ottawa is on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. It is important to acknowledge our it's basically impossible, I believe, to acknowledge our built heritage without acknowledging the Algonquin people as the customary keepers and defenders of this land. Please note that those who do not need to participate in the meeting can also watch it on the live stream on the Ottawa City Council YouTube channel. A reminder to participants to please keep your microphones muted until I call on you to speak. I will provide each committee member with the opportunity to ask questions or comment on each item in the order in which they raised their hand in Zoom. Committee members will be called on first, followed by any other members of council who have joined the meeting. For panelists, the raise hand option is found at the bottom of the participants list. For attendees, you will find the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And for those calling in, press *9 to raise your hand. The committee coordinator and I will be watching for those cues. The usual 5-minute speaking limit will apply. Members are also reminded to submit any motions, visual supports, or declaration of interest in writing to the coordinator at their earliest convenience. Although the deadlines have passed for residents to register to speak and provide written submissions to this subcommittee, residents may still provide written submissions to Planning Committee and/or Council. If you have technical difficulties signing into the meeting, you can contact the clerk's office at committees@ottawa.ca or by calling 613-580-2424, extension 22953. A reminder that if participants are having technical issues with their Zoom connection, they may call in using the backup telephone number provided by the coordinator. At this time, I have received no regrets. Could the committee coordinator please call the roll? A reminder to members to unmute themselves when they're called.
Member Halsell. Member Podolsky.
Present.
Councillor Shirelli. Councillor McKenney.
Present.
Member Conforti.
Present.
Councillor Brockington.
Here.
Councillor Moffat.
Here.
Vice Chair Quinn.
Here.
Chair King.
Present.
You have quorum, Chair.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none, are the minutes for the meeting of October 13th, 2020 confirmed?
Confirmed.
Confirmed. Thank you. Communications. In terms of communications, we have received a status update from staff concerning 50 The Driveway in response to Councillor McKinney's inquiry. The response from staff has been added to the record. The next item is planning, infrastructure and economic development, right-of-way, heritage, and urban design services. 1, application for demolition and new construction at 390-394 Bank Street, a property located in the Centertown Heritage Conservation District, designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Can staff please provide an overview of this report?
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. So yes, this application, as the chair mentioned, is for the demolition and new construction at 390-394 Bank Street. Next slide. The property is designated under Part 5 as part of the Centertown HCD. As you can see on the map, the property is located on the west side of Bank Street between Florence and James Streets. Next slide. The property contains 1- and 2-story frame and masonry buildings with commercial and office uses, as well as a former restaurant and patio. The structures make up nearly the entire block between James and Florence Streets. And if we go to the next slide, with the exception of a rear lane that runs between Florence Street and James Street, and you can see that on the left image, and also a vacant parcel next door at 406 Bank Street, and that's on the right. Next slide. There's also a surface parking lot at the rear of the buildings and the patio, as you can see here. Next slide. These are the views looking north and south on Bank Street, across the street from 390 Bank, and to the south on Florence Street. There are 2- and 3-story red brick buildings, which are considered contributing properties in the HCD. Next slide. The proposed development includes the demolition of the existing buildings on the lot. These buildings are considered non-contributing buildings in the HCD, and they are likely constructed between 1950 and 1970. Staff have no objection to their demolition, as they have very little cultural heritage value and do not contribute to the character of Centertown. Next slide. Following the demolition of the existing structures, the applicant intends to construct a new 9-story mixed-use building in their place, with residential units on the upper floors and commercial and retail space on the ground floor. 2 levels of underground parking are also accessed off of the rear lane. So this is the site plan, and you can see the proposed building will cover the majority of the lot. It's set close to each of the lot lines. Next slide. So this is the landscape plan. As you can see, since the footprint covers most of the lot, there's very little soft landscaping. However, there's some at-grade amenity area proposed along the rear lane. Next slide. So this is the Bank Street elevation of the proposal. The ground floor, as you can see, is made up of glazed storefronts divided by masonry piers, and it features a metal sign band. The middle stories are made up of irregularly spaced red brick clad balconies that feature a brick screening detail, large windows, and glass railings. The top 2 floors and the mechanical penthouse are stepped back, and they're clad in gray metal panels with taller, narrower windows, and features rooftop amenity space for the building. Next slide. At the intersection of Bank and James, the building features a recessed entrance, as well as a corner step back at the 5th floor. The building also includes step backs at the southeast corner above the 4th floor. And if we go to the next slide, you can see there are also step backs at the rear. So in order to facilitate this proposal, a zoning bylaw application is required for relief from the traditional Main Street zone provisions, as well as the heritage overlay. Provisions are also required related to the accommodation of a pedestrian easement on Bank Street and to facilitate a commercial patio. The zoning bylaw application will be considered at an upcoming planning committee meeting, and there's also an associated site plan application that's forthcoming. Next slide. So staff have reviewed the application for new construction using the Centertown HCD guidelines, in particular those for commercial and mixed-use infill, which has specific guidelines for the Bank Street corridor. The purpose of the HCD guidelines is to encourage the maintenance of the Main Street character on Bank Street as it runs through the core of the HCD. The guidelines seek to ensure that new development respects the quality of the street in terms of height, massing, setbacks, and architectural treatment of the facades. In general, the project meets these guidelines as outlined in the staff report in terms of being distinguishable and contemporary in design, yet also sympathetic to the character of the area in terms of the primary red brick cladding, the form of brick balconies. It also reestablishes the continuous commercial frontage and includes an appropriate distinction between the treatment of the ground and upper floors. And it also incorporates a distinguishing corner element. However, As on the screen, I've included summaries of the guidelines which relate to a number of proposed conditions that the committee will notice are part of the recommendations this morning. And this is where staff believe the proposal could be further refined. I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes to go through some of the rationale for the first two conditions. I'll try to be brief. If we go to the next slide. So the proposed building at 9 stories is not in keeping with the general character of the district or with the guidelines, typically being 2 to 4 stories in height, as you can see in the images on the right. So the key consideration for this proposal was to ensure potential impacts of this height are mitigated and that the historic low-rise character of bank is respected and reflected in the design. So although the applicant has made efforts to reflect the character in the proposal in terms of setbacks at the north and south corners, the brick detail and the form of the balconies, which the architect has indicated are inspired by layers of brick coursing, these references to that low-rise character are very subtle. So staff have recommended a condition requiring the applicant to introduce an additional design element that more noticeably reflects that lower scale turn of the century character of the HCD. In terms of best achieving this, staff recommend that a step back along the Bank Street facade be introduced at or below the 4th floor in order to reference that historic character, particularly the buildings across the street. Next slide. However, staff recognize there may be alternative ways to improve compatibility and reflect the Bank Street character. And that might be achieved through the incorporation of different design elements or a combination of elements. For instance, it might be a string course or a brick detail that could take cues from surrounding historic buildings, such as those in the top left image, or potentially to extend the proposed brick screening detail above the square-shaped balconies as a way of referencing some of the other brick details along Bank Street. The applicant could also explore the introduction of a lighting plan that could highlight the lower floors in the evening. And I've included this image, obviously, in the top right. This is not in Ottawa, but just to give an idea of how the applicant might highlight certain elements at the lower floors. So staff have proposed condition A and have crafted the language of the conditions so that different solutions can be contemplated and introduced through the site plan process. Next slide. Although the material palette is generally sensitive to the Centertown character, another key consideration for this proposal was to ensure that the materials, and particularly those at the street level, were highly reflective of the character of the area. So the proposal includes the use of concrete for the columns on the ground floor on the north facade of the building. However, exposed concrete evokes a very industrial character, which is unrelated to Centertown. So staff have included condition B, requiring the applicant to use brick instead for these columns, something similar to the brick pilaster seen across the street at 413 Bank, in order to better reflect Centertown's cultural heritage value, particularly as the proposal wraps the corner and transitions to the residential area on James. Next slide. Staff have reviewed the proposal and determined it meets Parks Canada standards and guidelines. The existing buildings are of little cultural heritage value, and the removal will not affect the overall cultural heritage value of the HCD. By providing ground floor commercial and upper floor residential units, the new construction maintains the associated cultural heritage value of the Centertown HCD. Staff are also satisfied that the proposal meets the Centertown secondary plan policies and CDP guidelines. The CDP has guidelines related to infill in the HCD, and staff are satisfied that the project meets those guidelines through the use of the red brick cladding, the recessed entry at the corner of Bank and James, as well as the articulation of the facades on the ground floor. Next slide. So just quickly to wrap up here, a cultural heritage impact statement was prepared by Bray Heritage for this proposal, and it's attached to the staff report. Staff generally concur with the findings of the CHIS. This application has also followed the Heritage Planning Branch's standard notification procedures as outlined on the screen. Councillor McKinney and the Centertown Community Association provided comments, and those were incorporated into the report. And I understand the Community Association has a presentation this morning as well. Next slide. So in conclusion, staff are recommending approval of the application, subject to the condition for further design refinements, as I've mentioned, as well as the provision of exterior cladding samples and lighting details to be provided through the site plan process and prior to building permit issuance. Additionally, recommendations have been included to delegate minor design changes and issue the heritage permit with a 3-year expiry date. Thank you.
Thank you, Mackenzie, for that excellent presentation. I do believe that we did receive correspondence that was submitted to the clerk's office from Heritage Ottawa, and we do have a number of registered speakers today. We do have Jamie Posen and Miguel Tremblay from 410, who will provide a visual presentation and are asking for more than 5 minutes jointly if possible to provide that presentation, and I'm happy to provide that flexibility. So I would invite 410 to begin their presentation.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to make sure everyone can hear me first. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you for the extra additional time beyond the 5 minutes. We do have 3 members of the team who will be part of this presentation, although we don't expect it will be strung into 3 sets of 5 minutes, totaling 15. I suspect it'll be a bit less than that. But I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Jamie Posen. I'm a senior planner with 410 Consultants. And with me here from the team, I know Miguel's name was mentioned. He wasn't able to make it, but from the team, we also have Carl Bray from Bray Heritage, who prepared the CHIFs. And we also have 2 members from Raw Architects, Roland and Karsten, who designed the building. So they're quite prepared to speak to design elements of the building as well. So the developer for this project is Urban Capital. We at 410 have been working with them for several years on this project. It's taken some time to be refined to the point where everyone was happy with the design to bring it forward. And certainly we've had a lot of discussions with both heritage and planning staff, and as well as a couple of visits to the UDRP. And the response at the UDRP was overwhelmingly positive. I personally have not experienced such a positive feedback at the UDRP, although there were a couple of suggestions. One of the suggestions actually is reflected in the image you see before you in the presentation. And Roland, I think, will get into a little more detail about it, but essentially the suggestion was the upper brickwork on the top 2 floors of the brickwork be brought southward a little bit to just increase that the step back treatment at the corner of James Street. So this view is looking from the northeast down southwest. And we actually chose this image to put first and foremost because we think that it really gives a good sense of how it will be experienced from the street. And there was a lot of talk in staff presentation about the corner treatment. And I think that both applies at grade with the patio space there, but also in the upper levels in accordance with the UDRP comment. So with this change, we as a team have arrived at this design that everyone's very happy with and very committed to amongst the team. We've had several discussions with staff on detailing why we feel that way, and the presentation that will proceed right after I finish speaking here, I think will detail some of those elements and where the thought process that went into them, both from an urban design standpoint and from a heritage standpoint. With regards to the staff report, there are, as the committee knows, there are 4 recommendations. And in general, the team is quite happy to comply with those recommendations. I will flag, there have been discussions as well already with staff regarding the condition B, 2B, which is with regards to the brickwork around the columns on the northwest part of the building. And with regards to that, we feel that that would be an inappropriate design response to what's meant to be a contemporary building, and in the spirit of heritage compatibility of also having a building of its own time and not kind of a Frankenstein approach of putting bits and pieces together from different times. We feel that would really compromise the integrity and the spirit of the architecture of the building. And of course, I can let Roland speak to that in more detail, but we would be seeking from the committee a request to have that one condition removed, but the other three are fine. And we as a team are happy to work with staff, particularly on the first condition on possible design approaches going forward into the site plan control stage. Now, I seem to have lost the presentation here. Was that deliberate or?
I can put it back up.
Okay, thanks. Because we have obviously several slides to go through here. So maybe I'll request the next slide, please. So this just gives a little bit of context. Of course, I think by now with the staff presentation, everyone's familiar with where the site is. Of course, it's the former James Street pub that recently closed, as well as the office building beside it, located at the corner of Bank and James. And I think we selected this image as kind of showing the variety of land uses, building types, built form treatments. There's a real variety of a range of, heritage context, but also more contemporary buildings all along Bank Street. And I think we'll return to this slide momentarily in Carl's presentation. Next slide, please. So all of those built form elements and treatments and buildings from different time periods really come together to create a really interesting and engaging Main Street. And as part of that, and with a contemporary treatment of this building, we are just thinking and projecting ahead to what development may look like over the long term, with consideration for both planning policies, but also heritage context and heritage designations, as well as development realities. This is an image that we did prepare for a meeting with staff and shared it with them, but basically to give an impression of that, how that variety will continue. We completely anticipate it will continue into the future, and it will not necessarily be a uniform treatment of built form of or character of architectural design by any stretch along this segment of Bank Street. So I think that's everything from me. I guess, just to conclude by saying we have had a lot of discussions with staff, and I think a lot of the information was brought out during the staff presentation in terms of, overall, I think all are on the same page that this is, an appropriate treatment for Bank Street and for the heritage context, with the exception of the second condition that I mentioned about the brickwork on the columns in the rear, and this question about the step back. We believe that the current design with the step back in the location where it is the right approach, and it's certainly not going to compromise any of the heritage condition along the street. Of course, Carl and Roland can detail that. I'll turn it over to Carl now. So yeah, it looks like Carl's still muted though. I don't know if we're able to unmute Carl. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Mr. Chair, committee members, thank you for this opportunity and good morning. Jamie has already given you a little bit of a peek to the future. I'd like to talk a little bit about the past and how we've come to the present. If Jamie, if you could go back to the previous slide, please. So when the Heritage Conservation District study was prepared by Julian Smith and his team back in the 90s, I think one of the main reasons why it was undertaken was that the neighborhood was changing, that Bank Street was going through an evolution, but more to the point, the residential neighborhoods behind Bank Street were also going through an evolution. And I think it's evident if you just look at James Street here, you'll see mid-rise apartments buildings coming into the residential neighborhood. And if you refer to the statement of cultural heritage value that you find in document 3 attached to your report, the emphasis on the character of the area is very much on its residential character, with Bank Street in a supportive role. So the intent and really the result of the Heritage Conservation District study has been to conserve the residential character of that neighborhood by moving any additional density out to the main street, which in this case is Bank Street. So it succeeded in doing that. The next thing I'd like to say is what hasn't changed. So up and down Bank Street, you have consistent mixed use. You have residential and you have commercial. You have buildings built to the street line. So that is something that is a continuity from the evolution, from the origins really of this neighborhood. So that's something that is also carried through in this proposal. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that, as you saw in the next slide, the policy context for Bank Street has evolved. And so you will be looking at higher densities along here. And so then it becomes an issue of how do you integrate new higher density construction within a heritage context. And I think this usually devolves, and you will get more detail from the architect to follow me. Usually it's in terms of massing and in terms of detailing and materials. So you have, as I mentioned before, a continuity of use, a continuity of relationship to the street, and really a success story in terms of the ultimate effect of the Heritage Conservation District study. So with that, I've kind of tried to set the overall context. I think the other things that you might want to consider are the ways in which contemporary architecture can fit within a heritage context. And there are a number of different responses to that, whether you work with very much a symmetrically designed facade, very much articulated bottom, middle, and top, or whether you are more playful with that. And I think the current design is in the latter category, but it still makes perhaps more subtle references to the overall context. And then just a final piece before I turn it over to the architect. Condition 2B does deal with columns. And one thing about traditional buildings from the Victorian era and before, anything that's really classically informed, columns tend to be round, and certainly in a corner location for practical purposes. Squared corners tend to get bumped off. And the pilasters that were shown in the presentation from the city are, of course, physically attached to the building, and they're on the commercial side, not on the back side. So it's just something to consider when you're looking at essentially the residential or the back corner of the new building. So in practical terms, what would make sense in terms of an actual column shape and materiality. So again, in summary, I feel that the new construction meets the intent and the guidelines of the Heritage Conservation District study. It offers continuity of use and continuity of built form. And it certainly fits in with the evolving policy context that the city has put in place, both in terms of land use and in design guidelines. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Roland the Architect. Thank you very much.
Note that 12 minutes have elapsed.
Hi, Angela, how are you?
Thank you, Eric. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. It's Roland Koltoff, Raw Design Architects. I'll be very quick then. I think staff and Jamie and Carl have done a very good job of introducing to the panel the design of the building. If we could go to a couple of slides forward, Eric. Next. So this one, the point we're trying to make with this image is to talk about Bank Street as being very heterogeneous. There is a number of different heights along the street. There's no consistent datum for us to refer to in the design of this building, we think. Next slide.
Oh, there she is. There she is.
So we're suggesting that we could have a very subtle relationship between this building and its context. This is intended to be a background building. James and Bank is not a major intersection within the city of Ottawa. Obviously, Bank Street's very important, but the James Street intersection is not particularly important for any other reason. But you can see from this diagram, we're trying to get the building to signal that it has a relationship to the street in various different subtle moves. And most importantly, the stepping at the south end and the north end, the green and the red lines that you see there. Next slide. And then there's the top, middle, and bottom, as Carl mentioned. Next slide. Now we have the vertical pattern, so we have the regular rhythm that people are used to seeing here. One thing I should mention here is that we're trying to create a very taut and simple facade in the building. As staff mentioned, there's the idea of the perforated brick or the brick screen around the balconies, the varying rhythm of the metal panels in the brick. But the brick has been treated as one plane, and where we step off that plane in this design, for instance, on the ground floor, it's a different material that you're seeing in the columns. And at the top where we step back again, it's the darker metal panels. So it's a very taut sort of skin that wraps the building, and where you cut away from that, there's a different material exposed. And I'll return to that when I talk about the northwest corner. Next slide.
Yeah, that's right.
So this is the street facade. So as I mentioned, the retail floor, which is recessed relative to the brick, that's a different material as it meets the street. And then at the top again, it steps back to the darker metal panel. And you can see here, you've got this sort of this slightly asymmetric composition, both on the vertical bays as you run your eye along the street front, but also from the north side and the south side, where you have a 4 and a 5-story stepping of the building and a cut back, a very significant sculptural move that cuts the building back, and we think creates the appropriate transition to our neighbors to the north and south. Next slide. A view from the southeast, looking up Bank Street. Again, you can see the step back for the retail to provide a broader sidewalk, but again, the material changes come off the major plane of the building. Next slide. So it's from the north, emphasizing the corner that Jamie was talking about. We're hoping that a cafe could come here, and this additional public open space could be well utilized and bring some more activity to Bank Street. Next slide. And then this is the corner where we're talking about the request by staff for brick on the columns. These columns cannot be in the same plane as the brick above. We have a turning movement for a truck that we need to accommodate here. We also think that this is sort of a classic maneuver, rather than having, say, a canopy projecting out to announce the residential entry, which is what you're looking at right here. We have actually cut into the building to create some weather protection for people coming in the front door of the building, and to basically subtly announce that this is the front door and the entry to the building. And framing that, we think, with just a simple concrete column is the way to do it. Again, the emphasis here is having a quiet design to the building, hopefully a very handsome and elegant addition to Bank Street, but not something that's going to shed out loud. We have used a traditional brick color to emphasize that. And with regard to staff's request to further study that sort of 4 or 5-story datum line, we're happy to do that within the language of the building that you're seeing here. So things like a very subtle brick coursing, lighting features to emphasize various parts. We're entirely happy to look at that and resolve that with staff going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. If that is the end of the applicant's presentation, then I invite committee members to ask questions. And I see a question from member Podolsky.
Thank you very much for giving me a chance to ask a question to the proponent. The presentation is very clear. I understand the architectural aesthetic. The question that I have for the proponent, and maybe Jaime Posen could answer this, and that is, what is the rezoning application in terms of height? Because it's not in the staff report. It just mentions that there is going to be a request for additional height, but the members, as far as I can see, don't know what that is. Would you mind telling us that?
Absolutely. Thank you. And through the chair, effectively the rezoning that will be coming forward to Planning Committee, along with whatever recommendation comes out of Build Heritage today, will seek, among a couple of other things, rezoning in height that would effectively implement the policy framework that's already there in the secondary plan. So the secondary plan already calls it being a traditional Main Street designation all along Bank Street, basically bottom to top up to the core area. Allows for 9 stories, and that's exactly what is proposed here, is 9 stories. And so the rezoning application that incorporates the request for 9 stories is increasing. You know, I don't have the numbers in front of me. I want to say it was, I think, around 20 meters, and then the request would be for something like 30, 31. And I should say that the traditional Main Street zone that's already in place, sorry, to add to this, the traditional Main Street zone that's already in place allows for, I believe, 6 stories as of right.
Thank you. And Chair King, I have a second question, if I might.
Absolutely, please go ahead.
In looking at the staff report, the recommendation, I think it's 2A, that has to do with the whole question that in the Heritage Conservation District guidelines, it of course recommends a 2 to 4 story height maximum. And then this is in conflict with existing zoning and in conflict with the secondary official plan. The way in which there can be a significant gesture to this recommendation would be to have quite a distinct setback at the 4th floor along Bank Street. And I'm sure that you and staff had long conversations about that. That's quite understandable because it is a device that is successfully used in many cities to recognize the the Heritage Conservation District guideline of establishing a human scale presence at that level. I see that in the staff report, it is not specifically saying approve the project, but introduce a setback at that level. They're looking at some more subtle ways of establishing that line. Would you be prepared to introduce a significant setback at the 4th level as part of it if the committee really asked for that?
So, Mr. Chair, maybe I'll go first. I think all 3 of the presenters probably have something to add to this conversation, and with your permission, maybe we can allow all 3 to speak. But I guess I would say the member is certainly correct that we had ample discussions with staff about this particular issue. I think on balance, the feeling was, first of all, that to incorporate, and actually there were some, experimental drawings prepared for this reason to show how a setback at a lower level would actually really compromise the overall design aesthetic and direction that is part of the overall vision. I guess I want to emphasize just as in passing that having worked with many developers of these types of projects over the years, I can tell you that the commitment to this design is purely based on the design. There's no, financial incentive behind wanting to keep a little bit of extra floor space or anything like that. This is purely based on the integrity of the design, having everything of a piece and not compromising that. And I'm sure Roland can speak to that in more detail. But suffice it to say that we do feel that, first of all, it's an appropriate design response. Second, even from a heritage standpoint, that the design moves that have been made on the north and the south and still having that step back up on the top stories is adequate and certainly does not compromise the overall heritage character. Of course, that's more Carl's expertise and I can let him speak to that. So maybe I'll turn it to, maybe let's start with Carl first and then we can go to Roland after that, if that's okay with the chair.
That is okay.
Thank you. And is Carl able to be unmuted here?
There I am.
There we go.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, there were long discussions about this, and Mr. Podolsky is absolutely right. Quite a standard approach would be to have some kind of differentiation at 4 stories. In the guidelines, again, I would refer back to the context in which the guidelines were prepared. Things have changed since then. Also, In terms of the overall context, and you saw this in one of the elevations that Roland showed, it's kind of a hodgepodge up and down Bank Street in terms of heights. You have vacant lots, that kind of things. Really, the 4-story buildings are further to the south, and there's a small grouping of them. So there isn't really a consistent street wall. And the other thing about the notion of street wall, I think one of the concerns about having a step back, and I've seen this in other cities, is the notion of having a blank wall or essentially a cliff. So the pedestrian feels that they're kind of in a canyon. And I think one of the things that you can do to respond to that, and one of them is setting back the ground floor, which has been done here. The other is to make the facade more porous, and I'll leave Roland to discuss that in more detail. But with the setbacks in the balconies and with the kind of patterned approach of the brickwork, you get a much more intricate facade here up the face of it than you might otherwise have, say, with a commercial building where it's just a sheer face. So those are some of the subtleties. Again, I'll leave it to Roland to describe things in more detail, but that's my read in terms of what fits within this urban context within the HCD.
I can't really add much more to what Carl and Jamie just said. I think they described it quite adequately. In looking at Bank Street, if you look at the second slide in the slide deck, you can see that it's a very heterogeneous context that we're going into. It's not a consistent 4-story datum that one would look at. So we wanted a building that had a more that could be read in different ways as one went up and down the street, that made a nod to like a 4-story datum, maybe a 5-story datum, that, as Carl said, it has a very permeable front facade. You've got balconies there. You also have the brick scrim. You've got a subtle pattern of different materials that are working to create an interesting and facade to the building, while yet not having a very prominent or distinct sort of line of at 4 stories or even 5 or 6 stories. We wanted it to vary as one went along the streetscape, and we think that that's a good way to contribute to this context. We do a lot of mid-rise buildings, principally in Toronto, but also across the country. And actually, this is something that we're always struggling with. We do want to avoid the traditional wedding cake that one ends up with. If you just say, you got to have a step of 4 stories and you got to comply with this angular plane. There's a real risk to that, that you take a lot of flavor out of your city by insisting on this consistency.
And does that suffice, Member Podolsky?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have further questions from Member Conforti.
Thank you. Actually, my first question is similar to Barry's. It's involving condition 2A.
And sorry, we can't hear you that well.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe I'll just increase my volume.
Thanks.
I'm a soft speaker. Sorry. My first question is similar to Barry's, I think, and it does have to do with condition 2A. And I think it's more a question to staff insofar as how will you be evaluating whether the revision, or what you call an additional design element, how will you evaluate whether that meets this condition? Because when we're dealing with subtle design elements, it can be very difficult to determine if, okay, yes, that achieves what we're looking for. And I think Barry may have been alluding to that with the device of an actual physical setback, which can be more obvious as a baseline to measure whether this has spoken to the that datum line as you were talking about. So I don't know if that's more a question for staff, Mr. Chair, but.
If it's a question for staff, and it does sound like one, then we will have another round with staff after
Um,
the round with our presentees.
And I did have one more comment. I just wanted to thank the architect for explaining sort of.
Oh, sorry, it went soft again, your voice.
I just wanted to thank the architect for explaining the design elements, and that clarified a few things for me. I tend to agree that cladding those columns in brick doesn't really add to the design or add to the heritage character. You might consider cladding it in the metal panel, like the dark metal panel that you're using elsewhere in the building, just to help those columns maybe recede into that that corner that might achieve a better effect and sort of speak a little bit more to, I think, what staff is getting at, which is those columns maybe stick out as sort of industrial elements. So that's just something to consider, just a comment. But overall, I think the application is strong.
Thank you, Member Conforti. The next and actually, I do see that Vice Chair Quinn is raising her hand. I don't know if it's a point of order.
No, it's a question.
Okay, we are using the hands.
I can't find it.
Okay.
For whatever reason, I usually have it, but I don't have it today.
Okay, so well, I'm going to note
so
that
I'm
you're
waving.
on the list. We do have a Councillor McKinney up next.
Oh, I see. Could I follow her, please?
We then have Member Hassel and then also
okay.
Councillor Brockington. So you are on the list.
Just get me on the list. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. I also overall happy with the design of the building and the building itself. I think that obviously the use of red brick is important, and the different design elements that went into this. Important infill. I have to remember that too. I mean, this is encouraging more and more people to live downtown, to live on our traditional main streets. Certainly, that the development kind of across the street at McLeod and Bank and Gladstone and Bank, really revitalized Bank Street a few years back. Actually, Bank Street BIA was able to expand as a result of it. So, in terms of infill, what it will do for the downtown, I think is positive. My questions were, my main question was very similar to Member Podolsky, so I won't re-ask it. You have responded to that, and I think it will come up again later. Just two quick questions. I just want to confirm one thing. The condition 2B that you're asking to be released from brickwork around the columns, you're just referring to the columns then that are on James Street. Is that correct? The red brick would remain on the columns on Bank. Is that correct?
Yes. So the suggestion to release the condition is exactly as the member has put in, Mr. Chair. Effectively, that the design will remain exactly as is currently proposed, and it's only there were a couple of slides there that showed the columns in the back. And at least that's our understanding of what the condition is referring to.
Okay. And although it's not a game changer, I've never been fully convinced of the benefits of an overhang. I've always been skeptical. I know that there's another one being that was proposed on Somerset. It's not been built yet. Similar, it's a taller building with a recessed entry. I'd just like to ask your opinion of our staff. Does that lead to, in your professional opinion, to sort of a darkened entry, to possibility of, I don't know, just I always think of a place for garbage to blow into, or just a bit of a darker space. And again, I don't know that I feel strongly about it. I've just have never been fully convinced of their full benefit.
Thank you for the question, and through the chair, I assume this question is still directed at us. I know staff was mentioned there, but okay. So I guess the other piece of clarification is to confirm: is the question referencing the entrance to the residential on the James Street side?
No, on Bank.
Oh, on Bank.
On Bank,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so I think the overhang that is being described here is somewhat limited. It's actually largely to incorporate a pedestrian easement. So there were discussions with staff on the planning side and also on the right-of-way side earlier on in the process of how to, it related to potential road widening and these types of things. And after some back and forth, it was determined that the most appropriate approach was to have a pedestrian easement. Now my appreciation, and maybe we can get confirmation from Ra on this, but my understanding is that it would be at grade. So unlike the Elgin Street colonnade that I'm picturing in my mind's eye with the perfect books there, I think it would actually be level with the sidewalk in this case. So I think it's slightly a different scenario, unlike that step up that you get. But I don't know if Roland has anything to add to this discussion about that.
Yeah, I would say the counselor is correct that when you step retail back significantly from a public street, there is the chance that you're going to create a darkened area, and it's not attractive for retail. That's why people are moving away from these sort of arcaded storefronts throughout. In this instance, as Jamie said, we're just accommodating a wider sidewalk at the street. The step back from Bank Street is in the order of about a meter. It's not very much, and it's also relatively tall. So we're going to make sure that that's very well lit and very much seen as part of the street rather than something tucked in the back or hidden behind a column. It's all very much up front and very well lit.
That's right. And the one thing I'll just add as well about the lighting is one of the conditions before the committee today as a recommended direction from staff is to have a lighting plan as part of this. And certainly the at-grade treatment along Bank Street will be a critical piece of that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. As we move forward, obviously, I sit on the Bank Street BIA as well, and very strong BIA. And certainly in terms of animating the street and looking at making sure that it remains kind of accessible for everyone, really, and but has that sense of being busy and again, just overly animated really is important. So I look forward to those conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. The next person on the list is Member Halsall.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to expand on this discussion of lighting that we've been having in regard to the proposal, particularly as it concerns condition 2A for that step back. Bank Street, with its range of heights between vacant lots up to 9 stories, it has quite a bit of light that penetrates down to the street level, and that really enhances the pedestrian experience in the public realm, which I think for me is another asset to having one of those, having a setback, as Member Podolsky had recommended. So in your design, have you factored in not just how the building responds to the architectural context of the street, but also how it responds to the public realm and ideally enhances it for people using it?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. The design approach, I think I'll certainly defer to Roland momentarily in answer to the question. But I think suffice it to say that, and it relates to the previous question as well, that the integration and treatment and interaction with the public realm was absolutely forefront in our minds as we were looking at this design. Particularly the treatment at grade, and Roland has already mentioned in terms of the floor to ceiling heights at grade and the treatment of the pedestrian easement and these types of things. There's certainly been a lot of discussion with staff on the planning side as well. Included in that, of course, was a shadow study that was included as part of the application for the zoning amendment. But I think in general, in terms of the impact of the mostly positive impacts of the building on the public realm, I'll just defer to Roland maybe to add to that discussion.
Yeah, as Jamie said, we are proposing a roughly 1 meter setback at grade to widen the pedestrian sidewalk, widen the area free for pedestrians in the public realm in that area. The building's relatively transparent on the, well, almost entirely transparent on the ground floor, in contrast to the traditional brick that's used above with the screen and the balconies, etc. So there's a very distinct layering between the retail and pedestrian realm and then the more private residential realm above. We have proposed a taller space at the corner, right at the intersection of James and Bank, where we have 4 or 5 meters to the sidewalk in both directions, which hopefully will be animated by a little cafe to take up that space. But again, that's taller to ensure that we don't have a sort of dark backside to the building fronting onto Bank Street. So it's very open and public in terms of contributing to that environment. And then that's repeated yet again at the residential entry to the building at the James and the Laneway intersection. So there's a variety of depths of sidewalk and walking surface from the sidewalk to the building face as you go around the building, which we think creates some additional interest and variety to the streetscape.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next on the list is Councillor Brockington.
Thanks, Chair. I'm just trying to get out of a sunbeam here in my office. Quick question. Your interpretation of 2A, just so we're crystal clear, we're all on the same page. The staff recommendation says the applicant, in consultation with staff, introduce an additional design element. Can I just be crystal clear what your expectations are of what that means?
So our expectations of what the condition means. So I guess the first point is about timing in terms of it being, conditional upon moving forward by the site plan stage. Then, these are typically the types of things that would be incorporated at the site plan stage, which in this particular case, more often the two applications, site plan and zoning, are submitted together. In this case, they are separate and only zoning has been submitted so far. So when the time comes with the site plan application, we expect that that's when those discussions will happen, if not before. And we're quite prepared to have those discussions before that. Sorry?
Right, just the facade, it says to better reflect the low-rise historic character. So
yes,
to me, that implies there's something missing from your application that staff wants you to refine. So, I mean, I will ask staff that question as well, but are you okay with the wording in 2A?
Yes, we are. It certainly, it leaves it sufficiently open-ended that we're prepared to have these discussions, and there will be some back and forth there, but there's already been some discussion on the team side about possible solutions or ways to address this, or at least to get the conversation started. And with regards to that, there was some reference in the staff presentation, I believe, about some examples of what this might entail. I think it has, principally, it has to do with the creation or sort of recognition of where a datum line might be in that particular brand of brickwork that might be done, or these types of things. And I know just moments ago, Roland the Architect did mention that we're quite prepared to have those discussions. There might be some possible solutions there.
That's good enough for me. All right, thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And finally, Vice Chair Quinn.
Thank you, Chair. You'll be pleased to know I found my waving hand. Yeah, my question just comes back to one of my colleagues referred to, and it's the question of light, natural light, and the impact. Have you done any studies on the impact of natural light on the streetscape, across the street, etc., as part of your overall project?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. Yes, as I mentioned, part of the rezoning application was to prepare a shadow study. And so that went through more in line of the sort of rezoning and the planning side of things, if we're separating out heritage, so to speak. But that's, yeah, that was part of the initial application that was submitted several months ago.
And was there any consideration about coming back to the question of the additional design element at the 4th story, what impact it would have if there was a more significant setback. Would it make a difference on natural light, especially across the street? The west light would be coming across from behind the building, and it's part. I think the impact of heritage on a traditional streetscape, the public realm's experience of that, does come into our considerations. In my mind, it's not strictly a zoning question. So.
Yes, understood. Thank you for the question. So, Mr. Chair, I guess I would respond a couple of things, and I will toss it back to Roland momentarily. But I guess the first thing to say is there were specific design moves made, as mentioned, on the north and south side. So I think in the context of the question of how the sun moves, I think particularly the southern step backs that were made from that side would probably make quite a bit of difference there. I think one thing to bear in mind too, two things. One is, if we're talking about a step back, at the end of the day, the step back would probably be a meter or two, roughly, even if it were incorporated. And I don't think that would make an enormous difference in terms of the sunlight experience at grade. Another thing to consider is just in terms of sunlight is very important, and it needs to be considered. But another thing is actually that depends on the time of year that we're talking about. So in the middle of winter, it's always very nice to have the sunlight on your face and get a little of warmth. But actually in this hot summer, when you're in downtown, it's actually nice to get a little bit of shading. And the reason I'm saying this is just in terms of how high the sun is. And so in terms of, is that 1 or 2 meters of a step back going to make a difference when it matters most in the winter, when the sun is lower, as opposed to when it's actually higher in the sky in the summer, when you actually want a little bit of shade? Just something to consider. I don't disagree with the intent of the question at all, but I'll just pass it to Roland if he wants to add anything about this question.
If you could send that
well, I think the reality is that even a 4-story building would be casting shadow on the opposing sidewalk in the afternoon hours, regardless of the time of year. Our experience has been that in order to maintain sunlight on the opposite side on a north-south street like this is extremely difficult, and it would require probably a 45-degree angular plane almost taken from opposite curb. So any building taller than 4 stories is going to shadow, regardless of whether it's stepped back 1, 2, 3 meters. We're talking about a 9-story building here, and that is the planned context going to happen. So there will be shadow on that sidewalk. The one thing that would make a difference, and I believe does make a difference, is that we do have the cutout actually at the north end of the building on James Street, where we have it at the lower level and the upper level. So you will get more penetration of the late afternoon sun onto Bank Street. But a step back along the Bank Street facade will not have any significant impact, we think, on the shadow.
Yeah. And just to reiterate again, that the zoning in place now already permits a mid-rise building around 6 stories.
Okay, thank you very much. That's what I wanted to hear.
Thank you, Vice Chair Quinn. And noting that there are no other questions, I'd like to really thank the presenters on behalf of the applicant for their deputation. We now move on to our final presenter, who is Sean Barber on behalf of the Centertown Community Association. So I do invite Mr. Barber to begin his presentation, and I do believe that there are slides associated with that presentation as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thanks very much. My name is Sean Barber. I'm the president of the Centertown Community Association. I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to present the views of our community association here today. First, some background on our involvement with this development application. We met with FOTEN over a year ago. I think, in fact, it was with Jaime, to express our support for the development of the site. However, at that time, we also flagged our concern with the building design that we continue to have today. We submitted a letter to the city, which, as was mentioned earlier, is included in the city report. When the proposal was resubmitted a few months ago, we requested another meeting with FOTAN, but today we haven't heard back from them on this. Next slide, please. Slide 2 summarizes our concerns. For generations, Bank Street has been the spine of the downtown core. It's a hub of commercial activity and an important gathering place. It supports a vibrant arts, cultural, and culinary scene, and has important historic significance for our LGBTQ community. As we invest in intensification in Centertown, which we wholly support, we need to protect and enhance what makes Bank Street unique. And we can do that by following the policies and the guidelines that have been put in place by the city to serve that purpose. Next slide, please. I want to focus on 2 of those policies. The first is the Centertown Community Design Plan. In section 6.4 of the plan, it outlines the importance of step backs for all buildings in excess of 6 stories. In section 6.5 on heritage context, it states that new buildings adjacent to heritage buildings or streetscapes must use step backs to modulate facades to be compatible with surrounding heritage structures. The current proposal clearly fails this test. There is no step back on 80% of the front facade to make it compatible with the surrounding heritage buildings. The UDRP pointed this out in their report in July, yet the proponent did nothing to take account of this lack of compliance with the guidelines. Next slide, please. The second applicable policy is the city's building guidelines for traditional main streets, specifically guidelines 10, 12, and 15. Guideline 10 reminds us that building height should bear some relation to the width of the street. Bank Street is narrow at this point, only 18 meters between the property lines. When building height exceeds the 1-to-1 ratio on the street-facing facade, as it does with this proposal, the building exceeds what the guideline describes as, quote, a comfortable sense of an enclosure. And I think this was one of the previous speakers kind of referred to this. The solution, of course, is to step back to upper floors of the building to get back to that pedestrian comfort zone. Next slide, please. Guideline 12 makes this point as well. To preserve the heritage character and scale of Bank Street, building designs must include step backs at appropriately low levels. Councillors, traditional main streets are sunny streets. Guideline 15 suggests buildings be designed within a 45-degree angular plane so our main streets can remain sunny. Who hasn't watched the Pride Parade or the Santa Claus Parade on a beautiful sunny day on Bank Street? What a different experience this would be if you were surrounded by 8- and 9-story walls, unable to see the sun. Next slide, please. Here is what the 45-degree angular plane looks like on this building. It intersects the building at the 6th story. Is it a coincidence that the community design plan calls for setbacks at lower floors? We can achieve height and density and also respect these guidelines. Next slide, please. These are 2 examples of mid-rise buildings that use step backs to preserve the heritage character and pedestrian friendliness of Bank Street. Next slide, please. Now compare these guideline compliant buildings with the design proposal we're reviewing today. There's nothing subtle or playful
1 minute
about
left.
the facade of this proposal. Next slide, please. As we've seen, we've got some buildings right, but we also have some examples of where we've got this horribly, horribly wrong. Next slide, please. In conclusion, we believe this proposal can be made heritage and building design compliant. If and when the building design is compliant with existing guidelines, we could support this project and would speak to it at the planning committee. Until then, the proposal does not have our support. In conjunction with Councillor McKenney, we would welcome the opportunity to work with the proponent to ensure compliance with Centertown planning guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barber, for your presentation. I'm now going to invite committee members, if they want to ask you questions, to virtually raise their hands. And there is a question from Councillor McKinney.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Sean, for coming out, CCA, for providing comment on this. Sean, you were obviously listening to earlier comments, and I think Member Podolsky had raised the issue of how the HCD is actually is the element not being met here in terms of the step back, at least at or below the fourth floor. Do you believe that as we work towards condition 2A to look at the additional design elements that can be implemented to better reflect the low-rise character of the existing streetscape? Do you believe that through that process that we could that would meet your request for a process to make changes if the applicant is willing to do so? If we're, I guess what I'm asking is, would it meet your what you're asking for to bring that conversation in at that time?
Thanks, Councillor. I have two comments on that. First of all, I didn't hear at any time during the presentation of the three presenters for the proponent a suggestion that they would meaningfully entertain any idea or of a step back below where it exists now, which is the 8th floor. So clearly, as you mentioned, and as Mr. Podolsky mentioned, and as others have pointed out, and as I did in my presentation, it not only fails the Heritage Conservation District guidelines, but also the guidelines for traditional main streets and the Centertown Community Design Plan. So it fails on 3 fronts. Having said that, we would be interested in participating in any process with you and city staff to find a solution. But for us, it's hard to envisage a solution for the reasons that I outlined that would incorporate anything other than some sort of step back. And the idea, and just to pick up on the point that was made earlier, I mean, I'm not an architect, but a 1 to 2 meter setback at the 4th or the 6th floor would have significant impact on sunlight, for example, clearly, because the sun is at various points in the sky during the day. So obviously, so just a common sense interpretation of that would suggest that step backs can achieve at those lower levels a dramatic improvement, and not only in the pedestrian experience, of feeling not enclosed so closely by a 9 or 8 story cliff wall, but also on the sun that's available during the day as well. So, we would be very interested in participating in a process. I must say I'm a little bit concerned by the recommendation in the city report that this be left to the city, the general manager of the planning department. I mean, these are important buildings on a traditional main street in downtown Ottawa. They should not be left to unelected officials. There should be decisions of people who are elected by members of the community to ensure that guidelines for buildings in their community are complied with. Shouldn't be left to unelected officials.
Okay, no, I appreciate your comments. So when we get to staff, I will pose that in terms of how we would move forward to ensure that condition 2A, that those additional elements that we are at least considering the use of step back to meet the guidelines. So I appreciate that, Sean, and I'm sure you'll still be listening at that time, so you'll have the answer. And there is time between now and when this goes to planning, of course, to do that. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you, Councillor. The next person with their virtual hand raised is Member Hassel.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Sean, for speaking today. You gave several examples in your presentation of what appeared to be more recent developments that have applied this step back approach. In your experience looking along Bank Street, is this essentially a reasonable standard that is typically faithfully applied? I guess what I'm saying is this a common expectation that other developers have taken on in good faith on the whole?
Well, I think the experience shows that some have and some haven't, and the problematic nature of that is that there are that subcommittees such as your own and the planning committee give exemptions to developers to ignore those guidelines, and we end up with buildings that are not compliant to guidelines. So what it does is and I've made this point elsewhere, is it erodes confidence in the public in the integrity of the process that leads to the development of guidelines. Everyone knows that there are exceptions. Everyone knows that life is not black and white, and there are times when you need to be flexible, and we accept that. But when we routinely see guidelines, in this case in 3 different places, as I said, the community design plan, the heritage district guidelines, and the guidelines for traditional Main Street, when those are routinely ignored, and developers are allowed to, I'm not anti-development, developers are allowed to build buildings that are in contravention of those guidelines. When there are clear examples in the vicinity of where those of buildings that are compliant with those guidelines yet remain commercially viable, it erodes our confidence in the process, and I think it does a disservice, frankly, to the democratic process. So I think you are the custodians, you are the guardians, really, of the public trust to ensure that those guidelines are respected, acknowledging, as I said, that there are times when you have to be flexible. But as I said before, we support the development on this site. And we have no problem with the height. That's not the issue here. The issue is the building form, and the issue is our concern that if we continue to make these exceptions, that Bank Street will gradually become a canyon street, and it will lose the heritage character that it has for generations had. It's a sunny gathering place. We don't want it to become a canyon street. It will lose what it has been. It will lose its uniqueness for our city, and that would be a real loss, and that's what I'm here defending.
Well, thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you, Member Hassel, and thank you, Mr. Barber, for your presentation, as I see no other questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now, do the members of the committee, do you have any questions for staff? If you do, please raise your virtual hand. And I see the first person to raise their hand is Councillor Brockington.
I'm just wondering if local councillor McKinney would like to go first. It was a virtual tie, by the way, raising our hands.
It actually was, but no, you go ahead.
Thanks. I guess I'd like to hear from staff on the presentation we just had. We're being asked to approve a recommendation that does not have the same type of setbacks and angular that we've just heard. And I just want to give staff an opportunity to comment further and elaborate for the committee, please.
So sorry, so just so I understand the question, Councillor, to speak to the intention of the conditions?
Well, we just heard from the Community Association president concerns about the angular plane, the lack of setbacks, the fear that this and future projects may be quite abrupt up to the streetscape. So I just wanted to hear from you.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Councillor, and through you, Mr. Chair. certainly I can appreciate these are concerns, you know, as part of any application, and you know, and I think it's something we would consider as part of any application, this application and any heritage permit application going forward. But the sort of angular plane discussion, they're really more zoning issues, more planning related issues. So I think, you know, we would be looking, and we are looking at the impact on the character of the HCD and the cultural heritage value of the HCD.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around, because you're the expert. Is this application meeting all of our guidelines, or are exemptions being made for them?
Thank you. In general, the project meets the guidelines of the Centertown HCD plan. You know, I spoke to how the project is a contemporary design. It's distinguishable from the surrounding properties, heritage properties, but sympathetic in terms of its material palette and it, you know, basically the conditions before the committee today are to further improve that compatibility with the HCD.
Okay. I am pretty much open to the applicant's argument about the pillars. Their argument was a concrete pillar in conjunction with the brick look and feel of the exterior is a sort of a blended modern look, and I actually accept that argument that they're making, which would mean we would vote against 2B, which is your recommendation to go from concrete to brick. Do you have any further comment on that? To their argument about it being a modern or a blended modern look and feel?
Thank you for that, for the question, through you, Mr. Chair. I think, you know, there are many ways to achieve that sort of contemporary design for such a column that remains understated, while also kind of, you know, referencing the character of the HCD, especially as it does turn down James, which is a more residential streetscape. So in my opinion, the brick would be more in keeping with that streetscape character.
Okay, I will provide a comment after my colleagues have asked their questions, so I'll yield the floor. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Brockington. Now, Councillor McKinney.
Thank you, Chair. I also, on condition B, won't support it. I think that we can find a different way, especially given that it's around the corner on James Street. But on condition 2A with the additional design elements, I think that between now and planning committee, I would like to be able to work with the community and the applicant and staff to find a way to satisfy the design elements that should be, you know, more obvious through, you know, by way of the Heritage Conservation District guidelines. So just to staff, you know, how do we I'm not asking you how do we ensure that we get what we want, but how do we ensure leaving here that we get a process for at least having that discussion and trying to find a way to to ensure that we get the elements in that design, whether it's a step back or other elements that that break up that facade a bit on Bank Street. Is that I just don't want to leave here and find out that there's no that we have no teeth in what we're doing.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Councillor, and through you, Mr. Chair. I think certainly we can continue to work with the applicant and with yourself and perhaps the chair as well, going forward prior to planning committee on what different design elements can be introduced into the design. Certainly from staff's perspective, we do have a strong preference that it would be the introduction of that step back at the 4th floor or below. But we do want to be, open-ended and open to, creative solutions here. But as you mentioned, this would be going to planning committee. The zoning application would be going to planning committee, and we can certainly work with you through the site plan process as well.
Yeah, I mean, the issue for me is I don't sit on planning, and while I can be there and I can have that conversation at planning, today's the day I get to make it. I get a vote on it. So I just want to confirm then, if we accept the recommendations as is with condition 2A. Moving forward, there is an opportunity for us to come back through the planning process to get that step back, if that's what it turns out to be the best way of breaking up that massing on the front facade. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe that would be correct.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Now, Member Conforti.
Yeah, so similar to my comments earlier and similar to what some of my colleagues are alluding to, I think I would like to get some clarity on how staff is going to determine whether that condition 2A is actually met, because it's very difficult. Like we said, unless you're prescribing a setback, it's very difficult to evaluate when that has been achieved. And also, if we vote to support your recommendations, it won't come back to this committee for us to evaluate whether that condition, in our opinion, has been met in terms of the Heritage Conservation District.
Right. Thank you, Member Conforti, and through Mr. Chair. I think to your question earlier, you'd asked, how we would evaluate any changes to the design, and I think obviously we'd be looking at how any changes would impact the guidelines, the Centertown Each City guidelines, and ensure that the intent there is being met, and the statement of cultural heritage value is being there's no impact to the overall value. As I said, I think the preference from staff is to introduce that step back, but I think we are open to those alternative methods as well. I think it would be potentially a combination of those, all options, and I think we would work with the councillor and the chair to determine whether it was appropriate and satisfy that condition. And sorry, just to add, just to be clear, the final design would come back would go through planning committee and city council for final design through the planning process.
Right, but it would not come back to Built Heritage Subcommittee.
Right.
Because that's quite a range of outcomes. Either it's a design element, like a subtle design element, like lighting, or a setback. So it's hard for us to evaluate it today, I think. That was just a comment. Thanks.
Thank you. And next is Member Hassel.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Mackenzie. I just wanted to clarify, in your report, the recommendation is quite strong. Staff are of the opinion that the best method to achieve this would be the setback on Bank Street. And I just wanted to clarify with you, do you believe that this is significantly better than if they were to try lighting or subtle brickwork? Like, is this clearly the better option?
Thank you, Member Hassel. Through Mr. Chair, I do think the step back is the more obvious, is the most obvious approach in terms of reflecting that low rise character. So I think it would be the best option. But as I said, there are different ways to kind of reflect that low-rise character as well, that we would be open to.
Okay. And maybe this is more a general comment for my colleagues, but I wonder if we have identified through our city experts, through representation from the community, that one option in this recommendation is clearly superior. It may be in our best interests and then the community's best interest to settle on that superior option. That's my only comment.
Thank you. And next on the list is Vice Chair Quinn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to respond to my colleague's comment, but I'm going to start with the question of staff. This is in terms of consultation with the community. I'm just wondering, throughout this process, was there ever an opportunity for representatives from the community or a representative from the Centertown Community Association to review and work with staff and the applicant, as has been the case in other HCDs in the city? I'm not sure if those those processes are still sort of at the pilot stage and are not part of Centertown as of yet, but was there any opportunity there where people were sitting down together to really work this out?
Thank you for the question, and through you, Mr. Chair. So we do have a pilot program for pre-consultation in many of our heritage conservation districts across the city. At this point, Centertown hasn't been included in that pilot. So the consultation was through our general heritage permit circulation process, and also through the zoning application technical circulation where comments were provided.
Okay, thank you. And the representative from the Community Association seems to have indicated that attempts following their initial feedback to the applicant, attempts to reach out to them again didn't really get very far. So I think we've had, I think we can infer a limited exchange between the two here. So I think perhaps what I will do is wait until the, Mr. Chair, an opportunity for us to make comments, at which time I will then comment on my colleague's most recent suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. And I've been notified that Leslie Collins would like to make a comment and have an opportunity to make a comment. So I'll allow her the latitude of doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to back up what Mackenzie had said here regarding the process and how this ends up in front of this committee, or how we get to a final approval on this. So in reference to the condition, as Mackenzie has noted, we feel that a step back is the preferred option. We are open to other options, but if the committee in their expertise agrees with us, we would welcome a direction to have it be more clear in the recommendation. In addition, I think in terms of the final approval of this design, while the condition has been delegated to staff, the final plans would have to be approved through the site plan control process as well, which would obviously be in consultation with the board councillor. And as Mackenzie noted, the zoning bylaw amendment would be heard by both planning committee and city council following the conclusion of this heritage permit process. So there will be additional opportunities, not before this committee, but before the other committees. But as I said, if the committee does wish to provide staff with the direction that it be more specific in that condition 2A, we would welcome that. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the latitude.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I do know that Councillor Brockington raised his hand again for potentially a second round. So please go ahead, Councillor Brockington.
Thanks, Chair. Just very briefly. So I'm going to support the recommendation to demolish. I'm going to support the recommendation to construct the building as proposed by RAW Design. I would like to amend 2A to include the local councillor. And so, Mr. Chair, 2A reads, the applicant in consultation with staff, comma, I would like to add the words and the local councillor. And that way, throughout the remaining process, the local councillor who is in tune with the community can be kept in the loop on this process. So, Mr. Chair, that's an amendment I'd like to make to this motion.
Okay, and that amendment has been received.
Okay. Colleagues, I'm going to vote against 2B. I've stated previously that I do believe that a modern blend is acceptable for what's being proposed, and I'm not fixed to the brick columns. I understand the argument that staff are making. I don't think it is a detriment to the overall building once complete to have those concrete columns. To me, this is a very minor detail, but I'm just stating for the record my thinking on this. So I will be voting against 2B. So Chair, I think we'll have to tease that one out and vote on that separately. And then the other matters of this motion, I will be supporting. So I think this is definitely going to look better for Bank Street. I can tell you, I'm not in love with the current structure. I think it adds, quite frankly, absolutely nothing to this district, the building that we have now. So glad to see the evolution of this corridor, and what's being proposed, I think, will be certainly a net benefit to this part of Bank Street. So I'm looking forward to seeing that done. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. And we just received a reminder from our committee coordinator that the subcommittee will need to consider an amending motion that you've suggested. Now I see that Councillor Moffat has his hand raised.
Thanks. Just it should say ward councillor, not local councillor. Just for procedural purposes, it should be specific to ward councillor. That's all.
Thank you. And I see that Member Podolsky also has his hand raised.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair King. In listening to the intervention by the Centertown Community Association, and having listened to the case made by the staff report and the proponent, I think what is at stake here in recommendation 2A, which has to do with the whole question of the Centertown Heritage Conservation District guideline for Bank Street to reflect the kind of 2 to 4 story height scale. It's a vision for the whole street. And yes, Bank Street is heterogeneous right now with different heights, some of which are the low-rise buildings, some are higher. But I think that this Heritage Conservation District guideline, if it is intended to achieve its purpose of having infill and buildings that conform to the zoning bylaw or conform to the secondary official plan for greater heights, I think that we have to decide whether we're serious about creating a built form along all of Bank Street that is distinctively incorporating a 3 to 4 story massing element. So it's bigger than just what happens at this block. So we have the choice, I think, in recommendation 2A of requesting a setback at the 4th level, and or we should probably alternatively revisit the guidelines, that particular guideline, and only select certain parts of Bank Street where there are existing buildings that are likely to stay and maintain this low-rise datum line. It seems to me that the intent of the Heritage District guideline was for the whole street. And what we've heard from Jaime on behalf of the proponent is that it is not about fighting for every square foot of space from an economic point of view, but it has to do with an architectural approach. And there was a comment made by the proponent that they didn't like that if you did have a setback at the 3rd or 4th floor, that this would create a kind of wedding cake design. And wedding cake was treated in a kind of pejorative way. Maybe we're thinking, Moscow and the Soviet buildings that stepped up. But really, you can actually create excellent contemporary design, playful design, by incorporating a setback along this entire block, which could vary. I mean, it could vary up and down a bit. It could be, let's just say, approximately 4 stories. I would leave that to the architects to handle. So it seems to me that this proposal is a huge vote of confidence for Bank Street. It meets so many objectives that we have for the revitalization and intensification of the core of our city, and Bank Street in particular, the introduction of mixed-use building and residential, retail upgrade. I think this is a very, very positive thing. And the architecture that RAW has come up with, I think is it's more than adequate. It has some gifted qualities to it, which I quite admire. And I think that I would encourage the architects and the planners in this case to seriously take into consideration the recommendation of this committee if we agree to specifically calling for a setback as an amendment to recommendation 2A, and work with that and achieve something that is playful, that contributes a building that is fun for the street, as you would like to achieve, but at the same time sets out the spirit or confirms the spirit that Bank Street in 10, 20, 30 years time will have a datum line along the storefronts, which can come right to the street, that somehow gives a sense of scale for the entire street, like Rotterdam did when it rebuilt its downtown, in the 1950s. So having said that, I would certainly support the staff recommendation, but amend 2A in order to incorporate a setback there. And I agree with Councillor Brockington and others that recommendation 2B requiring the cladding of the concrete in brick, I wouldn't support that. I like the architect's language here. I think it is creative. And so that with that, Councillor Brockington, I would support you on that one as well. So thank you, Chair King. And in terms of the wording of an amendment, I would leave that to others to recommend the actual wording. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the last person on the list is Vice Chair Quinn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to begin by also reiterating what my colleague Barry has said about, and others today, about how important this project is for Bank Street. The potential to revitalize this area of a heritage conservation district is fantastic. I think there's lots of positive potential here. I think the design is good, and it just but where it has not met expectations from my perspective and others today is with regards to the heritage conservation guidelines. And I know there was a slide, I don't recall which member, whether it was Mr. Bray, that presented sort of a future viewscape of the street showing potential development in the future, and how this was an opportunity to demonstrate how the street is going to evolve over time. And I think it also, from my perspective, immediately what came to mind is that being the case, just how important this project is for that stretch in setting a precedent of what the right approach should be. And he also mentioned the cavern effect. Of course, I experience this regularly every time I drive or walk west of Island Park Drive on Richmond Road, where we have that effect. You just sort of run until you can catch up to where the sense of being on a traditional main street sort of reappears. And that would be a real negative if we allowed that to happen here. And so for me personally, I think the fourth story setback is critical to the success of maintaining the sense of a public realm and the sense of that datum line for this stretch of Bank Street. So I too would like to see the condition 2A strengthened so that it actually stipulates more strongly that this is how we would like that change to happen. I also would support Councillor Brockington's recommendation that we vote on the two conditions separately. I do not support 2B either. And I also support bringing Councillor McKenney, the local ward councillor, into the process going forward. And I think also from a broader perspective, engaging the community association in future plans like this, I think is really just really important. So perhaps I leave it to my colleague Hal Saul, who first brought this up, to come up with the wording. So that's my those are my comments. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. And I will also add to this discussion. I agree that the existing buildings are non-contributing and support their demolition to enable the proposed construction to proceed. The proposed development, in my estimation, would provide new mixed use that would be a welcome addition to the streetscapes and the neighborhood, while meeting the recommendations outlined in the Cultural Heritage Impact Statement. However, given Bank Street's prominence as Ottawa's main street, I do support the provision of a step back, especially if it can be accomplished without dramatically altering the proposed design. So I am open to staff's recommendation for a direction that incorporates a larger step back at the fourth floor, at the fourth level, to preserve the active transportation experience for the future. I believe that such a design element better reflects that type of design element better reflects the historic low-rise character of Bank Street and does mitigate the effect of that cavernous approach of a 7-story street wall. So I would ask staff to whether it's appropriate for us to have a direction. And I see that staff is actually working on a motion to include the step back, and we will have it shortly. And I also support the strengthening of that stipulation in 2A to really add the ward councillor to the dialogue and to ensure wider public input into the process. So at this point, do any other members have comments on this item? Because I know that we have formally had a time where members can provide comment, and I do see that member Podolsky has raised his virtual hand.
Thank you. Just one point that I think should be tabled in our discussion here, and that is there have been quite a bit of discussion about the potential value of a step back like this in providing more light, more natural light into Bank Street. I think that we should recognize that this will not have any effect on permitting more natural light into Bank Street winter or summer. This is a 9-story building, and we are not, and neither the secondary official plan nor the zoning has an angle plane built into it. Angle planes such as we have on Spark Street, which is specifically measured in order to prevent light to come into the public realm. So I think that the step back is purely intended to establish a low scale to this street that has a presence, even though it's a 9-story building, and it will provide precedent for future developments that continue to add to this. But I think we should concede that this has nothing to do with the addition of more light into Bank Street in this block. And by the way, I think that I didn't mention it to the developers, but I do really, really like and respect their transparency at grade to animate the pedestrian experience by having a glazed storefront and setting it back slightly. I didn't get a chance to say that before, but I just wanted to add that now. Thank you very much for your patience.
I appreciate that. And like I said, I know that members had been providing comment during the period to question staff. So that's, I do welcome the comments that you have provided, and I wanted to see if anybody else had any continuing comments to make as we await the amending motion from staff. And I do see that Councillor Brockington has raised his hand.
Chair, the only issue I have is whether we make what you suggested a mandatory requirement, or whether we strongly suggest to staff that as part of their discussion with the applicant and the ward councillor, that this be considered in the design element discussion. I'm a little apprehensive about passing a motion to make it a mandatory requirement of their design versus we strongly suggest to staff as part of your discussions with the applicant, this be one of the things that you discuss, that you raise. So I just wanted to clarify what your intent was with that tiered setback approach.
Well, I do see that we have 2 motions drafted that would split the vote on recommendation 2B after amendments have been considered. And then the balance of the recommendations, whether amended or not, will be considered. But I do, in a sense, want to defer to the ward councillor here, but I think what I was hearing was a certain level of instruction towards setback. I think that that's my understanding based on community input and ward councillor input, and also it seems to be the majority view of the subcommittee. So that was my thinking.
Yeah, if I may, Chair, thank you, and thank you to committee members. I think that going into this, certainly we were looking at condition 2A as a way of making the design, that front facade, more in line with the HCD guidelines. I think the conversation today really will strengthen that as we go forward. I think I'm sure the applicant has heard the conversation and understands the desire of the committee. So the subcommittee. So I do thank you all for that. And also, as I mentioned, condition 2B. I'm also, won't support it. I think that it's, if it were on Bank Street, different, but the fact that it's around the corner on James, it's an entry to driveway, commercial driveway mostly, and I think that there's just no real need to have red brick at that point, and certainly anytime red brick is exposed that way, and especially on a column that gets damaged, it's almost impossible to fix, and it becomes a bit of an eyesore. So I also will not be supporting condition 2B and will support the motion.
Thank you. And I do see that member Hassel also has her virtual hand up.
Yeah, I had it up, but I think I'm just going to lower it again.
Okay, so at this point, I guess we are just awaiting the amended motion.
Chair, I believe the motions are available if the committee wishes to consider them. And if I may, there would be the, unless there's some direction from the chair, there would be the two amendments considered first. The most recent amendment would be considered first. So Member Podolsky's motion to add the step back, followed by the earlier proposed amendment, Councillor Brockington's motion to add the wording for the ward councillor. After this, the members expressed interest in considering recommendation 2B separately. This could be severed and voted on, and then following the balance of the recommendations could then be considered by the committee.
Excellent. Excellent. That sounds like a plan. So we're happy if the screen is shared. Thank you. So we have the first proposed motion. I guess the question is who is going to move this this motion?
I'd be happy to do that.
Would be,
or
I guess this is Councillor Brockington's motion.
Sure. Yeah.
Not that one. That is, I think, Barry's. That's the step back.
Yes, I'd be happy to move that. I'd be happy to move that.
Excellent. And can you see it? I know it's very small on my screen. I'm trying to read it here.
You're both amending the exact same clause. Can you just find a way to put it all together into one motion? Like you're gonna have to amend the amendment.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we have this one that we still need the Brockington motion.
Yeah, it might be procedurally easier if we do have them combined.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. And so I know it's small on the screen, so I'm willing to read this motion that the report recommendations be amended to modify clause 2A to read: the applicant, in consultation with the staff and the ward councillor, introduce a step back at the fourth story on the Bank Street facade to better reflect the low-rise historic character of Bank Street to the satisfaction of the general manager, planning, infrastructure, and economic development department prior to site plan approval. So sorry, and I see.
I just want to make sure, is this a binding requirement that in order for this building to get built, the architect and the team must now include a four-story step back? Is this a mandatory requirement? Or is it? Okay, I just want to, staff is staff.
I'd let staff answer that.
I can jump in here, Chair. Yes, it is a mandatory requirement if the committee does pass this motion that the applicant would have to include a step back at the fourth story in order to build their building.
And that adheres to our own guidelines, is that correct?
That staff believe that this is one solution to, it is our preferred solution to the issue that we've raised with the committee today.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands or any other questions. So on the amending motion, is the motion carried?
Carried.
Carried.
Yes, carried.
Thank you. And now on to the next motion. Okay, excellent.
Chair, to clarify or to confirm, the next item to be considered would be recommendation 2B on its own.
Okay.
If that's correct.
Yes, it would be.
Chair King, it's Barry here, on 2A, a matter of English language. The teachers of English and the grammarians will probably suggest that in 2A, it shouldn't be introducing because it should be introduce. But I stand corrected by English teachers.
And I think we'll accept that grammatical correction. Okay. Yes, thank you. So on 2B, the applicant using brick instead of exposed concrete to clad the proposed ground floor columns on the north facade of the building. On the motion for amendment.
Opposed.
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 And
Opposed.
And I'm also opposed.
Chair, just to ensure that I'm able to record the responses of all the members, would it be possible to call a vote?
Yes, I'll call a recorded vote then.
Thank you, Chair. Member Halsell.
Opposed.
Member Podolsky.
Opposed.
Councillor Shirelli. Councillor McKenney.
Opposed.
Member Conforti.
Opposed.
Apologies, Member Conforti. Could you please?
Opposed.
Councillor Brockington.
Opposed.
Councillor Moffat.
I hate to nitpick, but what's the actual wording we're voting on right now? Everyone's saying opposed, but it's a yay or nay. So what's being actually voted on right now?
2B.
So are you changing the wording of it?
Yes.
To what?
My understanding is that the recommendation has been severed from the balance of the report recommendations. The committee is voting on its own,
Right,
on
so
this
then-
recommendation on its own, and then we'll vote on the balance of the recommendations as amended.
Okay, so no then.
Vice Chair Quinn.
Nay.
Chair King.
No.
0 yeas, 8 nays.
Thank you, and that's recorded. So now to move forward with the report.
Carried as amended.
Carried.
So the report's carried?
Carried.
Carried.
So this report is scheduled to be presented to Planning Committee on November 26th. The next item on our agenda is additions to the Heritage Register Centertown Heritage Study. Can staff please provide an overview of this report?
Good morning. Yes, I'm just getting my slides organized here. Thank you. How does it sound? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good morning. Okay, perfect. Members of committee, I'm Avery Marshall. I'm a researcher with the city's Heritage Planning Branch. This report, Additions to the Heritage Register Centertown Heritage Study, recommends listing 442 Centertown properties on the Heritage Register. It's quite similar to the report and the presentation that you saw in October. I'd like to go over the report and review how these properties were identified as candidates for the Heritage Register, and also look at the difference between what you're seeing today in this report versus what we brought forward in October. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is the second report recommending Heritage Register listings in Centertown. It wraps up priority listings in the Centertown area, and it's part of a series of reports that stem from the Centertown Heritage Study. The Heritage Register is the city's official list of properties with cultural heritage value or interest. And it's important to mention that listing properties on the Heritage Register and designation are separate and distinct. Designation is when a municipality passes a heritage designation bylaw. The bylaw is registered on property title, and changes to the property require approval from the city. Designation is not what we are talking about, not today. We're looking at listing properties on the Heritage Register. Listing is a tool we use to track and monitor demolitions. There's no bylaw, and there are no approvals from the city. The only Heritage Act requirement is 60-day notice in advance of demolition. Listing of property on the Heritage Register does not prevent owners from making repairs, alterations, or any additions to the building. If owners want to request removal from the Heritage Register, we do have a form. It's on ottawa.ca. The form can be emailed to staff, and we bring forward a report once a year as per our Heritage Register procedures. Next slide, please. So as I said, this report stems from the Centertown Heritage Study. One of the goals of the Centertown Heritage Study was to undertake a review of resources in Centertown and determine if the properties merit listing on the Heritage Register. The City of Ottawa hired a consultant to review every property in the study area and make a recommendation based on their findings. ERA Architects was hired. They're an award-winning firm. They specialize in heritage conservation and urban planning. The Centertown study area they looked at includes the core of Centertown's historic residential neighborhood. The area contains over 3,000 buildings and is bounded by Gloucester Street, Catherine Street, the Rideau Canal, and Bronson Avenue. The consultant created a database that inventoried all 3,104 properties in the entire study area. Each property was photographed and documented, and each property underwent a preliminary heritage evaluation and then was given a classification, which led to a recommendation. Next slide, please. So today I want to mention a bit more about the preliminary heritage evaluation that was done. The heritage evaluation looked at 26 different factors for each of the properties. That included the roof shape, cladding, style, building type, associated history, and the built environment or its context. That data was captured in an inventory form, which is available in the consultant's report as Appendix C. One of the key questions in the evaluation is, how does the property contribute to the character of the area? Does it define character? Does it reinforce character, or does it maintain character? In some cases, properties were determined to have no character. So what is character? Well, in this case, we're looking mainly at the building shape, its form, its materials, decorative elements, and craftsmanship. Part of this relates to the integrity, its wholeness. Are certain elements missing? I want to emphasize this question of character because the answer is a determining factor in whether the property is recommended for the Heritage Register or not. Properties that define or reinforce character are recommended as listings on the Heritage Register. Defining properties, those are the properties that we looked at in October for the Centertown report that came forward then. Character defining resources were the bulk of the properties in that list. Today, the report before you looks at properties that reinforce character, pardon me. So here we can look at a few examples. On the left, the photo of this building was evaluated that it defines character. So you can see it has decorative brickwork, it has an ornate wood cornice and a porch with millwork and turned posts. It demonstrates a high degree of craftsmanship. The photo in the center, this building is quite similar. The look is quite similar. The design is a bit simpler, yet the features are intact. And then on the right, the design of the building here is again quite similar. The design is readable. There have been a few changes, primarily a new opening on the upper floor and some alterations to the porch. It's difficult to see in the photo. The masonry was redone. It doesn't have a lot of detail anymore, but it's still a low-rise building with red brick, maintaining the area's character. And so it doesn't merit listing on the Heritage Register according to this assessment, but the photos center and left are recommended for the register. Next slide, please. So I'll go through a few more just quickly. So these are Centertown doubles. Semi-detached buildings are a common type in Centertown. So on the left, again, a photo of a building with quite a sophisticated design with many features intact. In the center, a bit simpler design with a central dormer. The two-story porch is intact. Even the transom windows are in place on the first floor. The transoms are the windows just above the main doors. And on the right, the design is nearly the same. However, we're not seeing a porch. The upper floors were converted to windows. Although the building on the right maintains Centertown's character, it's not recommended as a listing on the Heritage Register. So the next slide. So it's the last set of examples I'll show. So these three are the hipped roof buildings with a gabled bay. Again, quite a common building type for Centertown. And on the left, you'll notice this design has arched windows. It has elaborate details in the brick and in the wood. The bay is quite wide. In the center, a plainer version, same building type. The windows are rectangular, and it does have some wood elements. There's barge board in the gable there. And so the right side photo, again, a similar design, but no wood or brick detailing. The porch has lost its pediment. The window style has changed. So it was determined that it maintains character rather than reinforcing or defining it. The assessment looked closely at these subtleties. And I'm simplifying a bit here because, as I said, there are 26 different factors that were reviewed. Character is one of the many that were looked at in the assessment, but I do think it's a key one that I want to highlight. You can go to the next slide. So after the preliminary assessment was done, it fed into the classification scheme that was used for the Centertown Heritage Study inventory. So there are 5 classifications: significant resources, character defining resources, character supporting resources, those with no classification, and those that were vacant at the time of inventory. These classifications inform the recommendations for each property under study. You can go to the next slide. So just to reiterate that in October, we did look at the top 2 tiers. So that was significant resources and also the character defining resources. Today, the report before you captures properties in that 3rd tier, the character supporting resources, with one exception, 205 Catherine Street, which is a character defining resource. It was deferred through a motion at the October meeting. The 3rd tier reflects the majority of properties in the Centertown Heritage Study area, and most were constructed during the first period of build out. So that was 1876 to 1914. Over 1,400 character supporting resources were identified in the Centertown Heritage Study area. This report recommends listing under 500 of them on the Heritage Register. So I just want to go over how did we go from 1,400 CSRs all the way down to 441 in this report. The answer is mainly character. We can go to the next slide. So properties in that 3rd tier, character supporting resources, were further refined by how they contribute to the character of their Centertown context. They were determined to either reinforce character or to maintain character. Note that the term we saw earlier, define, is not used here. Define was used exclusively for the upper two tiers. In this tier, character supporting, it's either reinforce or maintain. Properties that reinforce character are recommended as Heritage Register listings. Properties that maintain character are not. So this report presents properties in the third tier, character supporting resources, that reinforce character. So these are the buildings that strengthen the Centertown streetscape in terms of design and material. Next slide. So why do we want to do this? Why are we listing properties on the Heritage Register or making that as a staff recommendation? A few reasons, mainly listing properties on the Heritage Register offers an interim protection. It allows for a pause before a building is demolished. Owners of listed properties are required to give 60 days notice in writing of their intent to demolish. And during this time, staff can review property details and the reasons for the demolition. The ward councillor and the chair of the Built Heritage Subcommittee are notified. Staff can use that 60-day period to further assess the property's cultural heritage value. We may ask to document the building or negotiate for some or all of the building to be retained. We may also use this time to determine if the building merits designation. If the building does not merit designation, the 60 days expire and the owner proceeds with demolition. And this is typically the case, that the 60 days expire. To date, all of the 60-day notices received have expired without council designating. I do want to mention that since this report was submitted, staff have received 3 new 60-day demolition notices. The expiries are coming up in December 2020 and in January 2021. The 60 days relate to total demolition, and this means that we can better track and manage demolition in Centertown, an area with increasing development pressure. Next slide. Just very quickly, I wanted to show this image. I know it's a bit hard to see, but the triangles here on the map, this is the Centertown Heritage Study area. They show where the proposed Heritage Register listings are located. So specifically in the report before you today, everything in document 1 is shown here as a triangle. So everything is outside the existing heritage conservation districts. And there's relatively even distribution throughout the Golden Triangle and also in the western area, and heavy clusters along McLeod Street in the east and then around Somerset in the west. Next slide. Again, just another view of what you're seeing in document 1. The 400 buildings in this report are representative of Centertown's building stock. These buildings are generally clad in red brick, 2 to 3 stories high, and were built before the First World War, reinforcing Centertown's look and feel. Nearly all of the buildings were constructed for residential use. The overwhelming majority are detached homes. Next slide, please. So for notification, property owners were mailed a notice back in June. The properties at that time were shown on a map on ottawa.ca with a note that the recommendation was they were potential listings on the Heritage Register and that further study was required. Staff reviewed the properties through September and October, and we sent another notice to owners in advance of this meeting stating that the city intends to add these properties to the Heritage Register. It included details about how to participate and contained a property information sheet. Following a decision by council, property owners will be mailed another notice informing them that the property was or was not listed on the register. Altogether, owners would have been notified on 3 separate occasions in 2020. And in addition to owners, we also notified Heritage Ottawa, the Centertown Citizens Community Association, the working group for the Centertown Heritage Study, and also Ward Councillor Catherine McKenney, who supports the goals of the study. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide. I want to say here that identifying properties of cultural heritage value is an essential part of Ottawa's role in heritage conservation. The October Centertown report saw 309 properties listed on the Heritage Register. The report before you today recommends another 442. So on the right side, you can see our little table there, potentially bringing the total of Centertown Heritage Register listings up to 751. So that's about 24% of Centertown's building stock. Listing ensures that demolition and development in Centertown are approached with a deep understanding of its buildings and with comprehensive heritage data for the neighborhood. This report wraps up the recommendations for Centertown heritage listings in Centertown. To conclude, the Heritage Register is a valuable tool in heritage conservation. Staff recommend that the Built Heritage Subcommittee recommend that Council list the 442 properties in Document 1 on the Heritage Register in accordance with Section 27 of the Ontario Heritage Act. This group of buildings reinforces the historic character of Centertown, one of the oldest residential neighborhoods in Ottawa. And that's the end of the presentation. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Marshall, for the in-depth presentation. It's much appreciated. As we move on, noted that we have no speakers registered on this item. However, we did receive correspondence from residents. So we've had residents objecting to the addition of 203 Flora Street, residents opposed to the addition of 557 McLeod, and residents as well opposed to 66 Park Avenue, as well as 540 through to 546 Lion Street North. I'd also like to note that I did receive some regrets from both councillors Brockington and Moffat, who had prior engagements, so they've had to leave the call. However, we do continue to have quorum for this meeting. Does the committee have any questions for staff on this item? And I do see that a member, Podolsky, has raised his hand.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair King. I should say that I'm very impressed with the comprehensiveness of this portion of the Centertown Register report. And I think your presentation was quite clear as it relates to the identification of character supporting properties that are identified on the list. Just a small thing, I appreciated your PowerPoint presentation that wasn't provided in advance to us, so that it would be very helpful to have that put on the website if it isn't already, so that we can keep it for our records, so that we can use that as a reference for future use. I support, the motion, but I would like to have staff address the 4 properties where property owners have objected to the inclusion of their properties. I know that the screening was quite subtle, very clearly done on the examples that you have. And would there be a way to, in fairness, to be able to present these 4 properties on the screen and explain in the same way why they are character supporting in a reinforcement rate rather than maintenance? Because I think that the public should understand that that has been addressed in those 4 examples, if that's possible. Thank you, Chair King.
Thank you. And we'll await staff response on that.
Sure. So from what I'm understanding, we don't have the slides prepared to go through each of the properties, but certainly we can provide that, or you can look up the addresses on Google Street View and have a look there. Quickly, I can just go through perhaps a few comments from, if I can pull them up on my screen and share a bit with you. So I might not have them in the same order, but I know 203 Flora Street is a is one that was brought up. And this property is one of the typical Centertown types that has been identified in the report as being more common in the neighborhood. So it's that hipped roof with asymmetrical gabled bay. And in this case, it was determined that it was a character supporting resource because it has those elements intact. So it has the two-story porch, it has brickwork with some detail, it has each of those elements. The information that was shared with the owner is that, you know, we have the year built circa 1910. So again, that first period of build out, it represents that first development. The primary style being Queen Anne Revival and vernacular. So I don't have a lot of other notes prepared on this one. So maybe I'll just jump to, here I've got McLeod Street in front of me. 557 McLeod. So again, the year built on file is circa 1910. Primary style Queen Anne Revival with a vernacular influence, brick, front gable, 2.5 story. So just to get in to the weeds a little bit on this one, I guess from what I can see in the photo in front of me, it has a wood barge board with quite a lot of detail. It has an enclosed second floor porch with heavy, like a wide eaves with, it looks like wood element to me in the photo. Looks like the window style is intact, perhaps a bit of stucco detailing as well. And so we are seeing sort of a more refined level of craftsmanship and skilled masonry in this example. So 66 Park, this is a 2-story building. So the style here is a bit different. It's flat roof, Edwardian classicist influence, Italianate influence, built probably closer to 1900. The year I have in front of me is 1902. And in this one, again, we have a primary cornice, wood, that's intact. There's a secondary cornice, it looks like, that's also intact. The windows have kept their segmental arches, and the porch has a pediment. So again, I do see a lot of elements there that would tell me the integrity is quite strong, and also that not only does it reflect the character of the area, but it also reinforces what we're seeing on the street and for that building type. I think the last one I have a note for is row houses on Lion Street. So these are right near Catherine. And so these, again, it looks to me have a similar style to the last one we looked at, circa 1900, again, flat roof, Italianate and Edwardian classicist influence. There's a wood cornice here, and I can see it stretches. It looks like it has end brackets. And again, it looks like the openings are intact. The brickwork looks good. It's quite simple. And certainly I'm not seeing a lot of features here, but I do, from what I do see, it looks like there haven't been significant alterations other than the porches have been removed. So I'm not sure if, I think that, was that all of them? That's my list, I think.
That is the list, yes.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, I hope that helps. It's hard on the spot. I'd be happy to provide more details and really look a little bit deeper at them if there were questions later. It's something, I think a few of these, this morning was the first I'd heard from the owner, so it's helpful to have a closer look.
Well, thank you for that explanation. I think that it is quite remarkable that out of the 442, there were only 4 property owners that question being put on the register. So I think that's really quite remarkable and quite rewarding. I would suggest, I'm prepared to vote, in favor of the whole list. But I think that when we come to the very subtle assessment of whether or not it is character supporting, worthy of register, and character maintaining, this may be lost on many people. It's very, very subtle. And I think that I compliment you on the work that has been done. And I think that the process of triage that you have accomplished certainly seems to be successful in getting public support because of the few number of exceptions that have complained about this. So I think that given the fact that the Heritage Register is not particularly onerous and that it's not necessarily leading to a Part 4 designation, I'm comfortable to support this unless others have other opinions. But thanks very much, Avery, for this.
Thank you. And Councillor McKinney has their hand raised.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, staff. It's quite the undertaking. And here we are at, at the second report, and we have an obligation as a city, and strong cities, do what they can to maintain their heritage, to ensure it's protected, and it's not always easy, but this committee over the years has done a commendable job of that, and the work that you've done here. Also, I mean, certainly in identifying in the first report those significant resources that we do have to take a look at. In a neighborhood like Centertown, like as you mentioned, it is one of the oldest remaining neighborhoods in the city. Quite frankly, we don't get a lot of infill except for on those traditional main streets, but we don't get a lot of infill, and it's as a result of the quality of our housing stock, and that good red brick housing stock that was built at a certain period, but that has been maintained over time. So it means a lot to myself as the local representative, but to the community on the whole. And I think that's why we can propose hundreds of properties to be included on the register, and we only end up with a handful, and not to dismiss that handful. And I was glad that Member Podolsky asked the question, and that Avery, that you were able to answer to I thought a pretty decent degree on why they were included. So I just one quick question. I strongly support the report and recommendations of the report. Happy to see it go through. When we're looking at the different levels in the register, and I don't know if you can answer this definitively, but when we're looking at significant resources and character defining resources, there could be some, especially character defining, there could be some case made to move that into Part 4 heritage. That's why we want that 60-day pause to go back and take a look, make sure that we're not losing something that is significant. What are the chances of something that is character supporting actually moving through at this time anyway to a designation?
I think it's quite difficult without having the 60-day notice and that rationale in front of us. But I think generally I would want to see there be a strong historical association that tells us more about it. I don't know that it would be focused on architectural design. I think we'd have to see more history there and a strong context there that would be in addition to that integrity and that character that we were talking about. So I think when you look at the 906 criteria for Part 4 designation, we'd have to make sure that we have quite a strong case in one of those three areas, architectural design, history, or context. And I think with the CSR, the CSRs, the character supporting resources, we need to have extra scrutiny on that design piece, that architectural piece. And I don't know that it would be there in each case, but I think there's potential for it being there in each case.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you again. I appreciate the work. And as I said, I will be supporting the report going forward. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. And I don't see any other hands raised. So do any of the members have any other comments on this item? If not, I'd like to echo Councillor McKenney's comments. The main focus of the Centertown Heritage Study, as we know, was to review approximately 3,000 properties located within the Centertown Heritage Study area in order to identify which have heritage value and are strong candidates for listing in the Heritage Registrar. Pursuing the protection of built heritage ensures the protection of architecturally and historically distinct buildings that conserve and preserve our city's aesthetic, historical, cultural, and social character. And so consequently, I'm also very much pleased to support the recommended listing of 442 Centertown properties to the Heritage Register based upon the comprehensive report presented to us today, which primarily evaluated buildings with character supporting resources that contribute to the overall character of the Centertown community. Character defining resources are properties that play an important role in defining the historic context, really clear, providing a clear reflection of the characteristic pattern, activity, or attribute of an area. And the Ministry of Heritage at the province notes that identifying properties of cultural heritage value or interest is an essential part of our municipality's role in heritage conservation. Listing properties on the Heritage Register is an important tool in planning for the conservation of heritage properties and provides interim protection from demolition as enumerated under the Ontario Heritage Act. I'd really like to congratulate our professional city staff for their efforts. This has been a massive task, and we really do appreciate the work that was done concerning this study, and I'm pleased to also support this report. So with the report being in front of us, is the report carried?
It's carried.
Carried.
Thank you. So it's carried, and this report is scheduled to be presented to Council on November 25th. The next item on our agenda is additions to the Heritage Register on a citywide basis. So can staff please provide an overview of this report?
Yes, certainly. This is a brief presentation. In just a minute while I get myself organized here. Okay, so this report, additions to the Heritage Register citywide. It's a citywide report. We're recommending 21 properties across Ottawa on the Heritage Register. So again, the Heritage Register, that's our official list of properties with cultural heritage value or interest. Next slide. Heritage planning staff, reviewed 21 properties in this report. We consider each to have cultural heritage value or interest, and that's linked to architectural design, community history, or to neighborhood context. Many of these properties are recommended as a way to correct addressing errors or omissions from the Heritage Inventory Project and also the Sandy Hill Heritage Study. Several come to us as a result of recommendations from community design plans. The two shown here on this slide, oh, I forgot to go to the next slide. I'm stepping ahead of us. It should be back one. Oh, maybe I'm on it. Sorry about that. So several come as recommendations from the design plans, and then the two here are requests from the homeowners. And so both these photos were submitted by the owners as part of their request to staff. So next slide, please. Listing properties on the Heritage Register, again, that's a mechanism that tells us about Ottawa's heritage building stock. It offers interim protection to the property, and it allows for that pause before a building is demolished. No bylaw, no approvals from the city, it's not designation. As I said in the previous presentation, the only requirement is a 60-day notice in advance of demolition. And we do a review during that time. We look at 906, we look at potential for designation. And if we don't move forward, we don't find that it warrants designation, the 60 days expire and the demolition proceeds. Again, there's no concern with repairs, alterations, additions. Homeowners can make changes as they wish. And if owners want to request removal from the register, they can go to ottawa.ca and have a look at the form for buildings for properties listed on the Heritage Register. A note on the photos here in front of you, these are 3 in the report that came to us from the Stittsville Main Street Community Design Plan. And so we can go to the next slide. In terms of notification, owners were mailed a notice in advance of this meeting stating that the city staff recommend listing their property on the Heritage Register. The mailout included how to participate in the meeting today and also a property information sheet with, again, a custom photo and details about the property. Following a decision by council, property owners will be mailed another notice informing them that the property was or was not listed on the register. We also notified Heritage Ottawa and councillors for each ward where the properties are located. The building you're seeing in this slide is the Iona Mansions in Hintonburg. Next slide. And this is the last slide. So in terms of policy framework, I'll mention that the city's official plan states in section 2.5 that the city will maintain a heritage register according to the Ontario Heritage Act. The provincial policy statement does say that long-term economic prosperity should be supported by encouraging a sense of place and by conserving built heritage resources. And then section 27 of the Ontario Heritage Act does allow municipalities to list non-designated properties of heritage value or interest on the municipal heritage register. And so the 3 photos are examples of buildings staff are recommending for the Heritage Register. This is a property on Arthur Street in West Centertown. The center photo, that's St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Richmond Village. And then on the right is Wendover, 26 Wendover in Old Ottawa South. In closing, staff recommend that the Build Heritage Subcommittee recommend that Council list these 21 properties in Document 1 on the Heritage Register in accordance with Section 27 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Marshall, for your subsequent presentation here on the citywide component that's before us today. As we have noted, there were no speakers registered to speak from the public today on this item. However, we did receive 2 pieces of correspondence. One was excitingly in support of the addition of 71 Holborn Avenue. And we also had residents who sought the exclusion of 446 Tweedsmuir Avenue to the register and have requested a deferral. Does the committee have any questions of staff on this item? And I see that nobody has raised their hands on this item. Just to follow up, do any of the members have any comments on this item specifically? And I don't see hands raised. So I would just like to note that as we know, the purpose of Section 27, as reiterated by staff, concerning the Ontario Heritage Act, is to address a common problem faced in protecting heritage buildings, that of buildings being demolished and replaced before they can be assessed of their heritage value. Through the registrar, the city ensures that listed buildings are not lost before being identified or being formally recognized in the long heritage designation process. As a community, especially on a citywide basis, we should note that the listing of a property to the registrar does not automatically lead to heritage designation. Listing a property on the Heritage Register also does not prevent owners from making repairs, alterations, or additions to their properties. To reiterate, what it does ensure is that city planners have 60 days to assess a building to determine if it warrants protection before potential demolition. This is contrasted with the 20 days typically required pursuant to the Building Code Act for a decision to be made on a demolition permit. As a tool, the registry allows both city staff and councilors to provide a period of public notice, especially in scenarios where buildings are at risk of demolition, along with opportunities to promote knowledge and enhance understanding of the community's cultural heritage. For these reasons, I'm absolutely supportive of the addition of the citywide heritage resources to the listing as recommended by staff's report. Is the report carried?
Carried.
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 Thank you. This report is scheduled to be presented to council on November 25th. The next items on the agenda come from the Office of the City Clerk. Number 4, status update, Built Heritage Subcommittee inquiries and motions for the period ending November 2nd, 2020. There isn't a presentation on this item. As we know, based on policy and procedures, we report the status of inquiries and motions that are before committees, subcommittees. So does the committee have any questions for staff on this item? I don't see raised hands. So is this report received?
Received.
Received.
Thank you. There are no in-camera items that have been received to date. In terms of information previously distributed, we do have a report on designation refusals for the fourth quarter of 2020. That has been supplied for information. In terms of notice of motions, there for consideration at a subsequent meeting, none have been received to date. We have also not received any inquiries. Is there any other business? Seeing none, on adjournment, is the motion carried?
Carried.
Bye, everybody.
We
Have
are
a good
adjourned.
lunch, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. The next regular meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, December 8th, 2020. Have a great afternoon and a great weekend.
You too. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Bye.